Imagine waking up one morning to the crisp sound of birdsong, the sun beginning to stretch golden fingers across the horizon, and the air still holding that soft, cool bite of dawn. For Marcus, mornings on his ranch were always sacred. He'd built this life with his own two hands, working tirelessly for years, fighting against odds that never seemed to tilt in his favor. The land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was the physical embodiment of his blood, sweat, and perseverance. Every fence post he'd hammered, every stall he'd cleaned, every acre he'd tilled. It was all his story written into the soil. But on this particular morning, as he slipped on his boots and stepped outside with his usual mug of black coffee, something felt wrong. The air wasn't carrying peace. It was carrying intrusion. At first he thought his eyes were deceiving him. Across the far side of his land, he noticed tall wooden posts jutting into the sky like unwanted scars. He squinted against the rising sun, lowering his mug. His heart gave a slow, heavy thud in his chest. He walked further, his boots crunching against the gravel, and that's when the full scope of it came into view. His ranch, his land, his freedom was surrounded by a newly built fence. The structure was tall, aggressive, and foreign. It wasn't the kind of fence Marcus would have ever chosen. No, this one was cold and imposing, a barrier meant not to protect, but to control. His jaw clenched as he traced the line of wood and steel that cut across his land, boxing him into a smaller, suffocating corner of what used to be his wide-open ranch. And right at the front, standing proud and smug, was a massive locked gate. Marcus's chest tightened. He tried to open the gate, rattling the metal in his grip, but it refused to budge. Someone had put him in a cage, on his own property. The IT, local homeowners association. He'd heard whispers of them, of their constant meddling and their obsession with conformity. They were notorious in the area for hassling people over grass height, paint colors, and even the type of mailbox someone chose. But Marcus had always believed his ranch was safe from their reach. After all, he owned his land outright. He had worked years to pay it off. Surely, they couldn't just march in and dictate his life. But the fence proved otherwise. He stormed back to his house, each step fueled by outrage and disbelief. Who gave them the right? How dare they make decisions over land that didn't belong to them? He felt his blood pressure rise, his hands balling into fists. He had fought too hard, survived too much, to have someone try to strip away his dignity in the form of a locked barrier. Marcus's mind spun with memories, each one reminding him of what it took to get here. He remembered the lean years, when he had barely enough money to keep food on the table while saving every spare dollar to buy his ranch. He remembered the extra shifts, the long nights, the sacrifices. He remembered how people told him he was foolish, that a black man trying to stake his claim on a piece of land in that neighborhood would never be accepted. But he had proven them wrong. He didn't just buy the land. He had transformed it, breathing life into it with his hard work. Every inch of that soil knew his determination, and now here stood a fence he never asked for, one meant to belittle him, to control him, to send a message that he wasn't truly free. His phone buzzed, and he glanced down to see a text message from a neighbor. "Did you see what the HOA put up? Guess they finally got you too." Marcus's stomach sank further. Finally got you too. So this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. He set his coffee down hard on the counter and grabbed his truck keys. Minutes later, he was pulling up to the neighborhood HOA office, a small but polished building that tried to look more official than it was. Inside, the air smelled like lemon cleaner and arrogance. A woman with a tight bun and sharper eyes looked up from behind the desk. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with feigned politeness. "Yeah," Marcus said, trying to keep his anger in check. "You can explain why there's a fence around my land." The woman's lips curled, almost as if she had been expecting him. "Oh, that. The board voted unanimously. The neighborhood has to maintain a consistent look, and unfortunately, your property was considered unaligned with the standards we've set. Marcus blinked in disbelief. Unaligned with the standards? He repeated, his voice rising. This is my land. You don't get to put a fence around it without my permission. She adjusted her glasses, unbothered. Actually, sir, under the covenants of the HOA agreement, all residents must comply with structural decisions deemed necessary for the community. The fence is permanent. It's for the greater good. Marcus's blood boiled. Greater good? There was nothing good about trapping him on his own land. He leaned across the desk, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through her calm facade. You made a mistake, he said. You think you can walk over me, but you picked the wrong man. For a flicker of a second, he saw a crack in her confidence, a twitch in her expression. But then she leaned back, smiling faintly, like someone who believed they had already won. Have a good day, Mr. Carter, she said dismissively. Marcus walked out of that office with fire in his veins, the nerve of them, the absolute disrespect. He could still hear her voice echoing in his head. The fence is permanent. As he drove back to his ranch, the sight of that gate waiting for him felt like a slap in the face. He sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel, his chest rising and falling with anger. But slowly, anger turned into something sharper, resolve. He wasn't about to roll over. He wasn't about to be caged. That fence wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a battle he was ready to fight, and Marcus had never lost a fight when the stakes were his freedom. As the days passed, Marcus noticed the way people's eyes lingered on him. Neighbors who once offered casual waves now gave sideways glances, their expressions carrying a mix of curiosity and pity. Some whispered behind their fences, others simply smirked, pretending not to notice the injustice standing tall around his ranch. The HOA members, however, walked with a swagger. It was in the way they held their clipboards, the way they spoke just a little louder when he was nearby. They believed they had won. To them, Marcus was just one man, a black rancher surrounded by an organization with rules, money, and influence. But Marcus wasn't built to back down. He had lived his whole life hearing what he couldn't do, where he didn't belong, and why he'd never succeed. Every time, he had proven people wrong. That fence was no different. To him, it wasn't just wood and steel, it was a challenge. It was the HOA daring him to fight back, and Marcus never turned away from a challenge. At night, he would sit at his kitchen table with the lamp casting shadows across the papers he'd collected. Property records, survey maps, tax assessments. He studied them like a general planning for war. His father had always told him, if you want to win, know the rules better than the people who wrote them. So Marcus dug deep. He visited the county office, scrolling through records, asking questions, his pen scribbling notes until his notebook was nearly full. The clerks gave him tired looks, as if they weren't used to someone caring this much about the fine print. But Marcus wasn't just curious. He was hunting. And then he found it. Buried within a stack of old property records, he noticed a detail so small most people would have skipped right over it. The land where the HOA had built the fence gate, the single access point into his property, did not belong to the HOA. In fact, it wasn't even officially theirs to use. That tiny strip of land, just a few feet wide but strategically critical, was classified as tax-delinquent property. The previous owner had failed to pay for years, and it had slipped into the county's possession, waiting for someone sharp enough to notice and buy it. Marcus sat there in the quiet office, staring at the paper in disbelief. For the first time since the fence went up, his lips curled into a slow smile. The HOA thought they had boxed him in. They thought they had the power. But what they had actually done was put their entire plan on shaky ground, all because of arrogance. The Clark, noticing Marcus's stillness, leaned over and asked, "Something wrong?" Marcus shook his head. "No," he said softly, his voice edged with determination. "Something's very, very right." The very next morning, he returned to the office, dressed in his cleanest boots and a shirt his mother would have been proud of him for wearing. He signed the paperwork, paid the fees, and walked out the legal owner of that narrow strip of land. It wasn't just land. It was leverage. It was power. It was the key. When he returned to his ranch later that day, the fence no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a stage, one that would soon reveal the HOA's downfall. He stood at the gate, running his hand across the lock. "You belong to me now," he whispered. It didn't take long for word to spread. The HOA board members, who had been gloating only days before, suddenly realized their mistake. They called an emergency meeting, their faces tight with panic, their voices low but urgent. The rancher they thought they had cornered was now the man with the only key to the fence they had proudly built. Without his permission, no one, board members, contractors, even other residents, could pass through that gate. Marcus noticed the shift almost immediately. Neighbors who had once smirked now approached him with uneasy smiles. A woman stopped by his driveway, nervously clutching her purse. "Marcus, honey," she said, her voice sweet but trembling. "You'll still let us through, won't you? I mean, you don't want to cause trouble for everyone." He raised an eyebrow. "Trouble for everyone, or trouble for the HOA?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her eyes gave her away. Over the next week, residents began showing up at his property, each with their own plea. Some begged politely, others tried to guilt him, and a few even threatened him, though their threats carried no weight against the quiet strength in his stance. Marcus didn't shout, didn't wave his arms or lose his temper. He simply listened, nodded, and then reminded each of them of one thing: respect. The HOA, meanwhile, was unraveling. Their president, a man named Richard, who loved rules more than people, tried to bully Marcus with legal threats. Marcus received letters full of complicated jargon, stamped with the HOA's seal of authority. But Marcus had already done his homework. He knew the law, knew his rights, and knew exactly how much power that thin strip of land gave him. Every letter was answered with a calm but firm response from Marcus's lawyer, and every attempt to strong-arm him ended with the HOA backed further into a corner. Richard even showed up at Marcus's ranch one afternoon, red-faced and sweating under the summer sun. He pounded on the locked gate, shouting, "You can't do this! You're obstructing community property!" Marcus walked up slowly, his hat casting a shadow over his eyes, his posture calm but commanding. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words carried enough weight on their own. "This isn't community property," Marcus said, holding up the deed. "It's my property. And the gate you built? It's sitting right on top of it, which means you don't own it." "I do." Richard's face drained of color. For the first time, the man looked small. Marcus leaned against the gate, his hand resting casually on the lock. "Now you know how it feels," he said quietly, "to have someone try to control what doesn't belong to them." The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting match could have been. After that, the HOA board went quiet. They still met in their little office, still scribbled notes on their clipboards, but the swagger was gone. They knew they had lost. Their pride had blinded them, and now the man they underestimated was holding all the cards. Marcus continued living his life, tending to his land, caring for his animals, and walking the property that was finally and completely his. The fence, once a symbol of oppression, now stood as a monument to his victory. Every time he walked past the gate, key hanging from his belt, he felt a surge of pride. Not pride in defeating them, but pride in knowing he had defended what was his without losing himself in anger. What made it even sweeter was how the neighborhood slowly shifted. Residents who had once followed the HOA blindly began questioning their authority. Whispers turned into open criticism. People started pushing back, asking why their fees were so high, why their freedoms were so limited. The HOA's iron grip was loosening, all because one man refused to bow. Marcus never flaunted his win. He never rubbed it in their faces. Instead, he carried himself with the quiet dignity that had gotten him this far in life. But in his heart, he knew the truth. The HOA had tried to cage him, and instead they had caged themselves. The land had always been his sanctuary, his safe place. But now it was more than that. It was a reminder of what happens when you underestimate a man who refuses to be broken. Word traveled faster than Marcus expected. It started with murmurs at the grocery store, then whispers at the feed supply shop, and before long the whole town seemed to know what had happened. A black rancher, the man the HOA thought they had, boxed in, had flipped the tables so cleanly that he now held the only key to the very gate they had installed. People couldn't stop talking about it. Some spoke with admiration, marveling at his cleverness. Others spoke with bitterness, insisting he'd embarrass the neighborhood. But for Marcus, none of that mattered. He wasn't in this fight for attention or revenge. He was in it for principle. The irony of it all hit him hardest at night. Sitting on his porch with the key jingling on a chain at his belt, he often thought about how the fence was supposed to shrink his world, to suffocate him inside boundaries set by someone else. But instead, the fence had expanded his strength, his resolve, and his reputation. He had gone from being just a rancher, in the eyes of the HOA, to the one man in the neighborhood no one could push around. The very symbol meant to weaken. Him had become the foundation of his victory. One afternoon, as the sun bore down heavy on the land, Marcus noticed a small group of HOA members approaching his gate. They weren't strutting like before. Their steps were hesitant, their faces drawn. Richard, the HOA president, was at the front, his usual arrogance replaced with something that looked a lot like humility, though Marcus wasn't sure if it was genuine or just desperation. Behind him were a few board members and even a couple of residents who had once sneered at Marcus when the fence first went up. "Mr. Carter," Richard began, his voice awkwardly polite, "we'd like to discuss arrangements." Marcus leaned on the gate, his expression calm, his eyes steady. "Arrangements," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Yes," Richard continued quickly. "It seems we may have acted hastily. With the fence situation, the board recognizes that, perhaps some accommodations should be made. We're willing to negotiate." Marcus let the silence hang heavy in the air. He watched as they shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. For years, these people had held the community hostage with their rules, their threats, their arrogance. Now they stood on the other side of a locked gate, asking for his mercy. "Negotiate?" Marcus finally said. "When you built this fence, did you negotiate with me? Did you knock on my door, ask my opinion, or give me a say in the matter?" Richard swallowed hard. We followed procedure." "Procedure," Marcus said with a faint smile. "Funny how your procedure only works one way." The residents behind Richard began murmuring, their discontent clear. Marcus noticed their unease, the way they looked at the board members with thinly veiled frustration. The HOA had overplayed its hand, and the people they claimed to represent were beginning to see it. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the key, letting it dangle from his hand where everyone could see. The sunlight glinted off the metal, and every pair of eyes followed it. "This key isn't just a piece of metal," he said. "It's respect, it's fairness. And until I get both, this gate stays locked." One of the residents, a woman who had once told Marcus he wasn't a good fit for the neighborhood, spoke up. "What do you want, Marcus? What will it take?" Marcus turned his gaze to her, his voice steady but firm. "I want the HOA to revoke every unfair restriction you forced on me. I want a written apology for the fence, and I want every resident to know what really happened here, that you tried to cage me on my own land and failed." The board members stiffened. Richard's face burned red with humiliation, but the murmurs among the residents grew louder, and Marcus knew he had them. Cornered. They were more afraid of losing their power with the community than they were of him. It took 3 more meetings, countless back-and-forth arguments, and more than a few slammed doors. But eventually, the HOA caved. They drafted a letter, signed by every board member, admitting their mistake. They apologized for the fence, rescinded their restrictions, and even offered to cover the costs of removing sections of the fence if Marcus wanted. Marcus read the letter carefully, every word sinking in like a victory earned not just for him, but for anyone who had ever been pushed down and told they weren't enough. He didn't smile or celebrate outwardly. He simply nodded, folded the letter, and tucked it into his pocket. When he returned home, he stood at the gate, the key in his hand. Neighbors gathered nearby, curious to see what he would do. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus unlocked the gate and swung it open. The creak of the hinges seemed louder than usual, as if announcing the shift in power to the entire neighborhood. "I don't need to keep this closed forever," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "But don't mistake my patience for weakness. Respect me and I'll respect you. Try to take what's mine again, and this gate will stay locked for good." The crowd was silent for a moment, before scattered nods and murmurs of agreement rippled through them. Some looked ashamed, others relieved. But one thing was clear: they would never look at Marcus the same way again. That night, as Marcus sat on his porch, the cool evening air settling in, he looked out at his ranch with a deep sense of peace. The land stretched wide and free, just as it always had. But now it carried a new weight, a story of resilience, of standing tall when others tried to knock him down. The fence still stood, but it no longer felt like a cage. It was a monument to a battle fought and won. Every post, every board, every nail was a reminder that he had refused to be fenced in, not just by wood and steel, but by arrogance, prejudice, and control. Marcus twirled the key in his fingers, its metal catching the porch light. To most it was just a key, but to him it was proof. Proof that no one, not an HOA, not a board of self-important neighbors, not anyone, could decide his worth or his freedom. As the crickets sang and the stars blinked awake in the sky, Marcus leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. The HOA thought they had written the ending to his story, but Marcus had taken the pen, rewritten it, and closed the book on his own terms. And as the night wrapped its arms around his ranch, Marcus knew one thing for certain: no one would ever try to fence him in again.